Chapter 1, Dakota Road. She had stalked the field mouse for nearly 20 minutes in the hot August afternoon sun. Frozen downwind in her stance, the cat was about to spring at her prey when a sudden shower of gravel from the road above pelted the tall grass around her. What the? She jerked her head and changed her stance from offense to defense as the mouse scurried off. This widespread rain of stones was unusual, something she hadn't experienced before, so she had no precedents to draw on for a reaction. She hunkered in the grass, torn between fright and flight as the rasping sounds of metal upon rocks pitched her ears back. The disturbance of the peaceful country air grew in intensity, raising the hair on her back higher as the sounds grew louder. He was a seasoned and careful biker, having laid his motorcycle down only once in 30 years of riding. But as he rounded the sharp left curve on the windy South Dakota County road with the sun in his eyes, several factors came together to bring him down again. There were scattered bits of loose tarmac from a long-neglected pothole on the curve ahead, but he had no time to see them before the glimmer of an old hubcap lying directly in his path caught his squinting eyes. No problem. With the man traveling at a speed of 60 miles an hour and a lean of nearly 45 degrees, his instincts calculated the danger factor, while his right brain signaled his arms to nudge the handlebars to change his arc of travel. He had performed this maneuver hundreds of times in the past, converting conscious control to unconscious reaction, and in the 200 milliseconds it took to overtake the errant hubcap, his motorcycle had cleared it with a foot to spare. His mind was just beginning to absorb the event when his eyes widened. The curve lost its bank before the road straightened. His trajectory was now too wide for an unbanked road. Shit! He throttled back and leaned to correct his path again, even as he heard the foot peg rasping on the pavement and felt the side tread of the big rear tire claw into the hot pavement. He knew his bike was within its limits of recovery. His muscles began to relax in anticipation of danger averted, just as the rear tire struck a fist-sized piece of tarmac and the bike's tail lifted from the road. Without surface friction to hold it down, the machine's back end yanked to the right. Son of a bitch! As the big black Harley-Davidson lay gracefully down on its left side, he leaned right and scrambled to hang on, knowing he faced less chance of injury if he stayed with the bike. He grabbed the handlebar with one hand and wrapped his other arm around the upturned foot peg as the friction of his dragging boots tried to pull him from the bike. Hang on, goddammit! Knowing fate alone controlled him now, all reflex action shifted to pure survival as his adrenal glands pumped raw energy into every fiber of his body, while sensory inputs to his brain began to shut down, saving him the agony of experiencing his injuries as they were about to occur. He felt the shudders in slow motion and heard the groans of his bike in muffled tones as the side carriage began ripping away under the strains of steel grating against tar. Within a fraction of a second, the bike was on the gravel shoulder, sending a spray of rocks into the ditch below as a foretaste of the impact yet to come. The change in surface tensions gyrated the bike wildly, ripping away the last bolt that held the foot peg to the frame of the bike. Suddenly his left hand on the handlebar was his only means to stay on the bike. Fingers strained, his boots dragged. Don't let go. Just as the bike became airborne at the edge of the shoulder, his grip wrenched loose. The bike began an arc into the tall grass 15 feet below, and its rider came sliding down the embankment behind it. Tuck your head. The bike hit the ground with a thud and a gusher of dirt. It landed 5 feet in front of a barbed wire fence, still traveling at 40 miles an hour, even after its slide down the road. Its glancing blow with the earth caroomed the bike into the fence with such force that the strained wires yanked the closest metal fence post from the ground and bent low the posts on either side of it. As the bike was coming to a stop, the man was rapidly sliding toward it in perfect alignment. They were soon to be reunited. I'm going to make it. He caught a fleeting glimpse of the bike as it was flopped unceremoniously on the ground by the tensions of the strained barbed wire, just as the uneven ground sent him tumbling. As he blacked out, his mind relaxed his body, and he went limp. He never saw the whipping fence thrust the unearthed fence post toward him like a drunken arrow in flight. He lay unconscious in the tall grass, entangled in the barbed wire. His senses began to return, and he heard the sound of a distant meadowlark, then smelled the odor of burnt oil mixed with the dank smell of freshly turned earth and white roots. I'm alive. His eyes started to focus, and he saw bright green blades of grass only inches from his face, one with scarlet drops of blood oozing down its shaft. He lay very still as sensations from his body began to enter his mind. He felt himself on his side, partly on the ground and partly suspended by taut wires. As his brain allowed more and more synapses to open, he began to catalog his injuries of cuts, punctures, and scrapes. These sensations came slowly, as if metered by a caring nurse, so as not to overwhelm him. He stirred gently and flexed his muscles. Good, no broken bones. He turned his head to survey the area in front of him. Only a few feet away lay the wreck of his expensive Harley, with hisses and steam arising from a twisted and bent heap. A deep moan rose up from his bowels. Jesus Christ, my wings, my Pegasus. He attempted to rise to his feet, and something tugged at his body, preventing him from getting up. Annoyed, he looked down and in amazement saw a post protruding from the right side of his chest. What's this? What the hell? The spill, the pavement on his leathers, the slide down the embankment, sure. But this didn't happen. It doesn't even hurt. No, it doesn't belong there. He struggled to his knees and grabbed the rusty green post with both hands, fully expecting to extract it and walk to the road for help. He pulled hard on it, but it wouldn't come out. Okay, don't panic. I'll take it with me. He struggled to stand up, but the tangle of barbed wire attached to the post kept him fast to the spot. Like a fish, like a goddamn fish, I'm hooked. Sure enough, as he reached behind his back, he could feel a triangular wedge of metal welded to the tip of the post tight to his back. The post had gone in easily enough, but like a fish-hook barb, it couldn't be extracted. He pulled on it again. Now the pain flooded over him as a witness to his true plight, and when he began gasping for breath, he felt his right lung wheeze and gurgle as his chest rose and fell. He stopped his struggle with the post and stared at it, waiting for it to go away. He stood there with his arms at his side as the post remained in his chest, the only sign of his internal agony shown by the beads of sweat forming on his brow. The beat of his heart marked the passing of time. Finally, his denial gave way to reality. He had his epiphany. I'm gonna die. Staring at the post, his acceptance opened a flood of emotions, beginning with fear and anger, then changing to peace and tranquility. As the sweat running down his face cooled in the breeze, a sense of utter detachment occurred, and he no longer felt a participant in events, but only an observer. With but a few outer signs to his thoughts, and in the necessity of his predicament, he had experienced in a short while all the steps to dying that for so many is protracted and intensified by the wonders of modern medicine. When his inner struggles were over, he looked up and saw the cat. She had seen the grotesque shape of the bike arcing down upon her and sprang 4 feet in her first leap, moving at a right angle to the huge machine's trajectory. By the third leap she was well clear of the point of impact, but her feline brain had no means of calculating the serpentine reaction of the barbed wire as the bike struck the fence. Like a child playing a bizarre game of jump rope, she bounded over a whipping strand of wire slicing through the grass at ground level, only to be caught by another strand waving wildly in the other direction. A barb ripped her belly as the wire flopped her on the ground next to the bike. There she lay, in a daze, as her eyes caught sight of the man struggling with the tangle of wires. When he looked at her, their eyes locked momentarily, then each one about tending to their own wounds. He managed to bring his legs forward and to turn himself partially toward the road above as he leaned against the wires for a backrest, while she slowly licked the oozing wound in her abdomen. The sound of an approaching car was heard in the still air, and both heads turned to look up the embankment. "Hey, down here," His feeble cry for help went unnoticed as the sound of the car diminished in the distance. The grade was steep, and the tall grass prevented them from seeing the car as it sped past. He stared up the embankment and into the silence. The road might as well be 1,000 miles away. The grass had already rebounded from his slide. No one would ever see them. I'll die alone, except for the cat. The cat. Here, kitty. She wouldn't come. He looked down at the fence post again and wondered why he wasn't dead already. He'd seen chest wounds before, many times in Vietnam, but never one this big. It must have missed main arteries and veins, but by the fullness he felt in his lung and the weakness overcoming him, he knew many small veins and capillaries were dumping lifeblood into the wound. He unzipped his jacket and pulled up his shirt to look more closely at the puncture and saw it was sucking air, so he stuffed his shirt tail around the opening until the gurgling stopped. There was nothing else he could do, so he zipped up his jacket and sat back, determined not to look at it again. He sat quietly, growing cold as his extremities lost blood, and began to view his life of 48 years in his mind's eye. It wasn't the grand panorama, that would come later. It was more as if he dumped a lifetime of photos from a box on his lap and picked them up randomly to look at. First he relived the accident, reviewing the event and his reaction, to see if he could have done anything differently to prevent his injury, playing the scene over and over in his mind. Satisfied, he concluded it was fate's choosing and not reckless abandon that put him in the ditch. Quit thinking about it. His mind then drifted between images of his wife of 26 years, his children, his friends, and other people he knew. Scattered among these pictures, he viewed his many motorcycle trips over the years. His wife never quite understood his need to ride, nor could he explain the melancholy that drove him to seek comfort out here, floating over back roads amid expansive scenery with the wind rushing through his hair and the deep rumble of twin pipes trailing off behind. He didn't ask her along very often, and she seldom asked to come. How could he bring her? This was his third place, his place away from work and home, where he tried to find himself. Most people he knew looked for it in bars or in hobbies, but for him it was communion with nature. It called him like a Lorelei, pulling him into her bosom, and he never felt so alive as when he caressed her hills and valleys among rocky places, or deep forests where silent roads weaved through her secret places. A car sped by unnoticed in the distance again, and he looked up, remembering where he was. Life had stopped him on the Indian reservation, just west of the Missouri River, on a desolate road for his last communion with nature. He looked at the cat as she moaned softly. He knew she was injured, but he didn't know how serious it was. He had always been around cats, and he liked them, and as he looked at her, she sensed his stares and looked up. Poor little bastard. I'm sorry I was the one who did this to you. Their eyes locked for a second time and lingered. Then the cat meowed. I know. Don't worry about it. Come here, kitty, he said. Come on, I won't hurt you. She wouldn't respond, so he rummaged in his jacket pocket and pulled out a stick of beef jerky. He broke off several small pieces and placed them in his open hand, then called again. This time she responded with a sniff as she slowly rose to her feet. All right, but it hurts to move. She was a large calico with short, thick hair and was obviously well fed. Half tame and half feral, she prided herself in feeding off the land without the help of humans, who had the odd habit of feeding animals only during the daytime. She didn't understand humans very well, but she enjoyed their company. She wasn't above wandering into surrounding farmyards to visit her tamer cousins, especially her two brothers in the farm adjacent to the field behind her, and grabbing a daytime snack from the communal food bowl. As the man held out the food in his hand, she thought it a token of apology for the fat, warm mouse chased off by this smelly machine next to her, so she decided to eat it. After a few steps, she felt something was wrong in her belly, but the food smelled good. His lap should be warm. She ate the jerky as the man caressed her body to feel for injury. He found no broken bones, but felt the gash on her underside. After he fed her more jerky, she crawled up on his lap and curled into a ball. As they both lay perfectly still, soft purring from the cat filled the quiet air and resonated up his body, soothing him with a sensation like the vibrations he felt on his bike when he rode down the highway. He slowly stroked her as he watched the sun inch toward the horizon. Sunset was coming soon, and with it the cold prairie night. "I won't make it through the night. Already my arms and legs are cold." He rubbed his hands together. They felt like a cadaver's skin. "I don't know if I'll even make it to sundown." He didn't care. Pictures of his family began to drift through his mind once again. Why didn't he say goodbye to anyone? He was moody again. He should have said goodbye. His mind began to race. God, what if they think I ran out on him, gone off to a better life? How will they know he's laying here in the ditch? They won't. They can't. He conjured up visions of them agonizing over him. Was he dead? Did he leave us? Is there another woman? He couldn't stand the pain he saw on their faces. He looked down at the purring ball on his lap, trying to think of a way to tell him what had happened. After a moment, it dawned on him. Of course, I'll send the cat. As he watched her sleeping, he formed his plan. This'll work. In a day or two they'll find me. They can have a funeral and get on with their lives. He struggled to sit upright, renewed with a sudden sense of purpose. Wincing with pain, he reached for the billfold in his back pocket. Good, it was still there. He removed his driver's license and unhooked the chain from the billfold to his belt loop, then reached for the knife in his pants pocket, feeling raw skin instead. Damn, the only spot his chaps didn't cover. He found a sharp stone embedded in his chaps to use as a substitute for his knife. Then he scratched "Dead in Ditch" across the back of his license in large block letters. He rubbed it on his bloody hip to bring out the letters in more contrast, then held it up to look at his handiwork. Good, half done. He pried the last link of the chain open with his teeth and removed the clip from the end, then used the barb on a nearby wire to puncture a small hole in the corner of the license. He was sweating profusely now, and every move was done painfully, in slow motion. He put the chain link through the hole in the license, then bit the link shut, breaking a tooth in the process. Just as he was about to attach the chain to the cat, it occurred to him, I can't send just a bloody license. What else? What else? His mind was becoming clouded from blood loss. Before he could think of an answer, he unconsciously pulled his wedding ring from his swollen finger and stared at it. Yes, this'll do. With supreme effort, he squeezed the clip at the other end of the chain and placed the ring on it. He then put the chain around the sleeping cat's neck and fastened the clip to a link for a snug fit. He tested the chain to make sure it wouldn't fall off, then lifted the cat and spoke into her sleepy eyes. Go, friend, go find a human, he said. Does she understand? Came the reply. Of course I do, but don't bother me, my belly hurts. He put her on the ground, facing the fallow field behind them. She just stood there, looking into the distance, so he gave her a hard pinch on the tail. Go, he said gruffly. She let out a hiss and gave him a menacing glance, then ambled into the field. He watched her tail disappear into the tall weeds and wildflowers, then listened intently to the diminishing rustles she made as she moved away from him through the brush. Satisfied she was not coming back, he began to preoccupy himself with finding a comfortable position. After he took the pressure off the post in his chest and relaxed into the wire backrest, he lay very still. He had no desire to move again. It's time to die. As he sat amid the tangle of wires with outstretched legs together, hands limp at his sides with his palms up, and his chin on his chest, he pictured himself like a marionette's puppet slumped in a corner with his strings lying jumbled and motionless all around. So he did appear, and the thought was even more poignant as the wires around him ceased their tiny oscillations and grew silent, while his own internal puppeteer, the willpower which animated him, also ceased to stir after his final act to send a message to his family was accomplished. His efforts now ended, the great and wonderful process of death began. Suspended between wake and sleep, he He glimpsed a still figure in glowing white at his periphery, smelt the dank upturned earth at his feet, heard the gentle rustling of grass about him, and then began to draw inward. As the last of his outer senses shut down, his eyelids drooped shut to close off the outer world for the final time, and he entered his own inner world, oblivious to all else. He watched silently from his mind with detached interest as death followed its course, and a myriad of minute and manifest elemental reactions began to shut his body down, as if a scurrying crew were turning off a giant electrical power plant and taking it offline from the power grid. As various systems and functions within him stopped, his consciousness began to gather into the center of his brain from remote corners of his vast inner kingdom, like messengers returning from faraway places. His microcosmic body became a bigger and bigger universe to him as his essence contracted more and more tightly into atomic dimensions. The further he withdrew, the vaster the distances became. The space from mind to extremities was no longer measured in inches, but in light years. Fingers that once could be moved and seen and had done his bidding were now a remote and lifeless blackness at the very ends of the universe. His heart slowed, struggling to pump the last few ounces of blood within his veins as the cat walked out of the field and stared at his dying body. She struggled onto his lap as he took his last few breaths. "I'm sorry. I wanted to die on your lap. I couldn't make it to another human with your message." When he had so rudely sent her on her way, she knew she was dying, but his thoughts were so strong she felt she must try to deliver the message. When she had gone several yards into the field, she could go no farther. She listened for sounds from the man, knowing if he was awake she couldn't return to him. Hearing none, she started back, but after a few steps she fell down. She was near death. Almost 2/3 of her blood supply was lying in her belly. No, I must go back. Those pictures in his mind, that woman, it must be his mate. If I die here, they'll never know he tried so hard. And the thing from his finger, it must be returned. She struggled up, fell again. It was hopeless. Then, with some mysterious group bond, her brothers at the farm nearby lay down in a deep sleep, just as she rose to her feet with a newfound energy. Sitting on his lap now and staring into his expressionless face, she tried to picture all these things to him. When she was done, she curled into a ball on his lap, sighed, and left this world as effortlessly as she came into it. His heart stopped, and he slumped. They had died only 4 heartbeats apart. The silence was now utter and complete. Even the wind stopped rustling the grass, and the distant meadowlarks grew still as the sun dipped and touched the horizon for his last sunset. Just as the billions of cells in his body were using up their last reserves, starved from the lifeblood lying still and dead in his veins, a loud cracking noise occurred, and the man awoke with a start. He opened his eyes and stared at the figure of himself lying there, as he stood a few feet in front of it. The sight didn't perplex him, and he didn't get excited or confused. He just stared calmly, remembering. In his teens and early 20s, he had experienced the same thing, once on peyote, and then several times on LSD. But this time, though, he knew he viewed a dead carcass. After the novelty of looking at his body wore off, he changed his focus and saw the cat lying on his lap. Damn, it didn't work. Why did she come back? His desire to send a message to his family returned, but without the cat, what could he do? He looked down at the body he now inhabited. It looked the same. Even the scrapes and cuts and tattered clothes were there, but he felt no pain. He catalogued his injuries again, and then it dawned on him, where's the post? It wasn't there. He breathed deeply and listened to his lungs. They were fine. He lifted his jacket and his shirt. No puncture wound, no tear on the jacket or shirt. I knew that damn thing shouldn't have been there. As he stared at his chest, something brushed against his leg. He looked down and saw the cat, then realized why she had come back to sit on his lap. So, you're dead too, he said as he stooped to pet her. Yes, she said. I already explained that. Weren't you listening? Shocked by the clarity of her reply, he stood up abruptly. What? He was at a total loss for words. I've been around cats my whole life, but I never guessed. Of course cats can think, she interrupted. Just because we can't make noises you call speech doesn't mean we're stupid, you know. After he gathered his wits and realized he didn't have to say words, but just think the thought, they had a lively discussion. They introduced themselves, and she commented how much better he could think his words now that he was dead. Then they talked about the accident. As the conversation tapered off, they stood there staring at their dead bodies. Looks like an old worn-out coat you just take off and throw away, he said. Church held no appeal for him, though he went periodically to appease his wife, nor had he any preconceived ideas about the afterlife. But in that moment of self-revelation, he unknowingly triggered the next step in crossing over, a step that many times took the learned and the religious a considerable time to accomplish. As he continued to stare, the angel put his hand lightly on his left shoulder. The feeling was exquisite, beyond words. There was a warmth and a peace that was compelling. He had an overwhelming desire to turn and face this wonderful being. But there was something he had to do. No, not yet. And so began a delay in his journey, a delay of many days triggered by another desire, a desire that even the angel would not interfere with. He understood about the delay, but he didn't care. He walked over to his Harley and sat on it, staring intently at his dead body. The cat followed and sat beside him, not saying a word, and the angel went with him as well, staying at his left side, just over his shoulder, just as he had faithfully done during the man's entire life as he roamed up and down the earth. The man's vigil had begun. The days came and went, daylight and darkness, sunshine and rain, hot days and cold days. The man neither saw nor felt them, only the still corpses and silent motorcycle appeared to his eyes. The rest of nature around him was basked in a continual soft twilight, like the light of the full moon on a cloudless night, except no shadows were cast. The light had no center. It appeared from everywhere and nowhere. He wasn't even aware of the time passing before him, as the unfolding of events by the motion of objects alone, and not the tick of a clock, marked the time in the twilight he now inhabited. Neither did depth nor distance enter into his mind. All appeared as a picture on a huge canvas. As he sat there stoically, he was aware of the commotion occurring among his family and friends, as they agonized over his whereabouts and plight. He was right about their reactions, but he couldn't make himself watch, for he knew there was nothing he could do about it. God Almighty, this is hard. I'm sorry, so sorry. He steadfastly kept his unblinking gaze on the corpse, knowing if he turned even slightly toward the disturbance over his shoulder, that he would be there. As the fears and anger, wailing and tears welled up behind him, it was like a heavy storm cloud in the distance, with thunder and lightning amid flashes of reds and greens. All he could do was concentrate on his final message etched in blood on the license, dead in ditch, and try to send it to them. The cat understood, so she also sent the message. It was clearer than his own. His oldest daughter sensed his thoughts most clearly, while many in his family had vague premonitions. After repeated imploring, the youngest son agreed to join his sister in following their father's routes in hopes of finding him. All along the way, from their home in Wisconsin to his destination in the Black Hills, they showed his picture in gas stations and restaurants, hoping someone had seen him. Once she had strong feelings, and they stopped their car along the main highway, only 20 miles from where he lay, not knowing he had taken a side trip on a county road. In the end, it did no good, even though they felt better for trying, for the living and the dead seldom make connections. So he sat there, waiting. On a crisp, cold day in late October, nearly 3 months after the accident, an old John Deere tractor slowly chugged along the ditch where he lay, while the power sickle at its side clattered away, mowing the tall browning grass in its path. As the tractor neared the wreckage of the accident, the old Indian driving it stopped the clattering machine and released the power takeoff. He climbed down from the bare metal seat and walked toward the corpse as the tractor putted patiently in the background. Then he squatted down and looked intently at the body. Not wanting to disturb the dead, he was about to rise and leave when his eyes caught the glimmer of the license. He carefully removed the chain from around the cat's neck, making sure he didn't touch the man's body, and as he pressed the clasp open, the ring fell unnoticed between the corpse's legs into the grass. The Indian studied the license and read the message scratched on the back, then looked at the cat. He understood. "You shall rest soon, my brother," he whispered. He returned to the tractor, lifting the sickle and locked it in place, and climbed back on. As he turned the tractor around and puttered away in the direction in which he had come from, the man watched quietly. A few hours later, an old pickup truck appeared on the shoulder of the road above the accident scene, followed by a short caravan of vehicles. The Indian climbed from the truck and pointed to the wreckage below as the others gathered by him. Then they all went down the embankment. As the sheriff and 2 deputies surveyed the scene, the coroner viewed the corpse and took pictures. After a short discussion with the sheriff, a rescue worker went to the rescue vehicle and returned with a hydraulic cutter. He cut the post protruding from the corpse to disentangle it from the mass of barbed wire. Then he reached behind the corpse and slid the remaining post section from the body and let it drop to the ground. 2 medics placed the corpse into a body bag after setting the cat aside, and just as they were about to zip the bag shut, the Indian came over to them with a request. "Put the cat in the bag with him," he said. "No, it's not proper procedure," said the older medic. "But it must be done." "No," said the man firmly. As they argued, a man with the wrecker winched the rusted motorcycle up the embankment and onto the hoist bed while deputies policed the area for evidence. The medics won the argument and loaded the body onto the rescue vehicle. Then everyone climbed back up the embankment. While the group discussed the accident with the sheriff in front of his car, the Indian slipped from the gathering and returned to the scene. He retrieved the cat and quietly went to the back of the rescue vehicle, unzipping the body bag, and placed the cat on the corpse's lap. "There, go in peace together," he said. He zipped the bag shut and then returned to his pickup and drove off. Shortly after, everyone left and the ditch was quiet again. The man and the cat watched them all go, then stood in silence. When the group had arrived, the man rose from his perch on the motorcycle and stepped back to watch as the cat wandered about the commotion. Until a medic had zipped the bag shut, he had sensed the revulsion on everyone's face to look at his remains. Even the coroner had winced. Although his body had decomposed and his bike had rusted, he saw the scene just as he saw it the day he died. The angel at his side had shielded his eyes from the sight, even as he had shielded the man's eyes from so much ugliness and destruction when he was alive. Now, as he stood there in an empty ditch, the angel touched him on the shoulder once more. Again he resisted. No, not yet. Soon a storm of renewed emotions from his family could be felt behind him for the second time. Although the lightning and thunder were now more muted, the clouds were darker and the colors were more intense. After the funeral and interment, the storm abated and all was quiet again. He stood transfixed, in a motionless and timeless state, waiting. Where's the angel? Now why am I standing here? 2 days after the funeral, winter came. The cold and snow howled around him. The long nights and dead landscape were ever at his feet, and he continued to wait. Spring brought a reawakening of the land, and soon the scene at the accident site looked nearly as it had the August before. Then, on a bright and cheery day in May, the Indian appeared at the embankment above. He looked at the tangled mass of wires, turned and disappeared, and then returned with a woman at his side. He pointed at the dangling post that had been cut by the medics and spoke to her briefly. Then she climbed down the embankment as the Indian stood and watched. As she approached the post, the man and the cat turned to watch her. She squatted down where the piece of pointed fence post lay and stared at it. After a few moments, she stood and moved the tangled wires away from the post. then got on her hands and knees and began combing the grass with her fingers, digging her nails into the soft earth. With a sweeping motion, she circled the post and returned to her starting point, finding nothing but a few pebbles and bits of metal. She repeated the process until beads of sweat glistened on her forehead. After nearly an hour, she picked up a ring and looked at it, holding it so the light reflected off its gleaming surface. She sat in the grass and wept softly. "I miss you, my darling." As the tears slowed, images of her husband arose to fill a void in the empty ring she held, and the image brought with it gentle, loving thoughts of her husband that emanated into the air around her. He sat down in the grass in front of her and watched her thoughts as they formed, soft and pastel, like a beautiful watercolor painting. With a rush of emotion, his love and compassion enveloped her like a ball of light. She couldn't see him, but felt his presence, like the presence she felt when he was alive and was in an adjoining room or on the bed next to her in the middle of the night. As he took in her thoughts and she took in his presence, they became enveloped in a reverie of spirit, like the reverie of love-making, only more subtle, more subdued. Suddenly it was very clear to him. God, how I love you. How many things about her he had misunderstood. How little he had really known her. The bond they had, it was so much more than the cumbersome and poorly chosen words said over the years. When it was over, they both sat in silence, drenched in perspiration. Finally she stood up and spoke for the first time. "I know, darling. I've always known. The bond, it's forever." He smiled his first smile in many months. "And now I know too." She got up and began walking toward the embankment. Then she stopped and turned. "You lost this. I'll keep it for you until we meet again, okay? Please, you can go home now," she said. And as she held the ring out toward him, she turned and walked up the embankment. He watched her disappear from his view as she walked over the crest of the hill. The Indian waved toward him, then turned and left. Yes, it's time to go home. He picked up the cat and stood there staring toward the road above, knowing that one day he would see her again. Then he looked up at the sky. Still smiling, he felt a gentle hand on his shoulder and smelt the faint odor of hyacinth in the air. As he turned toward the angel, he and the cat disappeared.